Okay, welcome to the Criteria A video. So how we can get the best marks in Criteria A for our paper 2. So Criteria A is the knowledge and understanding criteria. You probably know that already because it's the same across pretty much the entire IB course. And it tests how much knowledge and understanding of the Part 3 works and their context has, and whether you can demonstrate that in relation to the question. So for SL, you need knowledge of the Part 3 works to be thoroughly demonstrated and very good. For HL, you need it to be perceptive and persuasively illustrated as well. So we're going to discuss how you can make sure you do that in your paper 2 essays. So one of the first things that you could do is show your knowledge of the context, and you need to do this throughout. I mean, our Part 3 works are literature in context, so we know that's a big part of this anyway. Now, a lot of students either get freaked out by the word context because they're not really sure what it refers to, or just tend to repeat themselves. So I get a lot of George Orwell wanted this to be a warning and things like that, but context spans much wider than just that. And these are the key things that we can think of for context. So what motivated the author to write this text? What is the setting of the text? What was happening when the text was written? Who was the intended audience? And the audience reaction to different parts of the text. So I'm going to just quickly have a look at those things in relation to our Part 3 texts. So we'll start with 1984. In terms of what motivated the author to write this text, we know that Orwell wrote this because he was motivated by real experiences. So he fought against fascism in the Spanish Civil War, and also he'd experienced a lot during World War I and II. We also know it was a warning about totalitarian regimes, but if we look at it a bit more perceptively as well, it's a warning against propaganda and the media. Now, Orwell produced an essay talking about language in politics, which is very critical of political language used to sell certain ideologies. So we know that it's also a warning against that, and we can see that throughout the novel. The setting, I mean, it's quite obvious by the title, but it's 1984. We know that it's a dystopian future, but what's interesting about this is that in 1984, I mean, that wasn't too far away from when it was written, and that's very deliberate on Orwell's part because he wanted to show that this is kind of a recent threat that could happen. A lot of dystopians are set in a timeless society, but this is very specific. So that also links to what motivated the author and what was happening when the text was written, because this was a very real threat and Orwell wanted to really demonstrate that. So we know that Big Brother as well means that the setting is a totalitarian society, and Oceania, although it's not explicitly mentioned, is kind of London, England. So again, that kind of hones our setting a bit better. Sorry, I mean Oceania is England and Airstrip 1 is London. What was happening when the text was written? Well, it was 1948, so we know that post-World War II, by 4 years, but also there was a real threat of World War III at this point. It wasn't, those who study history know that World War II didn't just end and that was that. There were definite real threats straight after it of another world war, and lots of people believe that there would be. So that's significant as well and plays into this fact that it was a warning from Orwell. Who was the intended audience of the text? Well, I mean, if we break this into categories, the intended audience, I suppose, was a British audience, or just people who had experienced those things in post-World War II. But an audience in general is everyone. I mean, we're the audience studying it for our IB. So you need to think about that as well, and the different effects that will have on people. So some people will have experienced these kind of extreme societies that are presented in 1984. Others won't have, and therefore that creates different effect on different audiences. Remember, it was banned by a lot of countries at first, and you can have a look more into that as well in terms of why it was banned, but that's probably obvious. In terms of audience reaction, now there's really a lot of details that are very true in 1984, which might shock some people. But for example, the disgusting food, the cabbage and stuff, and the living conditions that is described are very true to life during wartime London. 2 + 2 = 5 is actually a real slogan that was used by the Soviet Union when they were trying to show that they could achieve their 5-year plan in 4 years. And so Orwell utilised that to take on a kind of different meaning in 1984, but still interesting that that was a real thing. Goldstein is commonly thought to represent Trotsky. So we know that Stalin often used Trotsky as a scapegoat for lots of things, and the party uses Goldstein to do that. I mean, Orwell does this in a lot of his novels. If you've read Animal Farm, you know that lots of those things are true to real life, so it's easy to see how it's the same for 1984. The violence in the novel and the brutality, not the Greta purges, sorry, a typo there, the Great Purges in Russia, that's symbolic of that. And also we've mentioned the propaganda and the media depicted in 1984, and that's based on the anti-Jewish propaganda during Nazi Germany. So really lots of different things that are true to real life, and how that links to the audience is that lots of people will know this and remember this, especially the audience for when it was first published. So that makes it incredibly significant and makes that warning that the book's intended for even more real. If we think about characters, I ran out of space for this, but characters, Winston's a really interesting one, because a lot of people might think that if 1984 is a warning, why wouldn't Winston succeed in his rebellion? Surely it's showing that there's nothing we can do about this. But I suppose you could see it as a warning for ever letting this happen. The fact that Winston fails is quite shocking and makes us want to stop these regimes more, if that makes sense. You've also got the proles and people like Mr. Parsons, who kind of represent the apathetic part of society, and that's also a warning in terms of let's try and stop this. Don't sit back and let this happen, because you will then bear the brunt of it, like Mr. Parsons does. Okay, in terms of Persepolis, sorry, there we go. So what motivated the author to write this text? Well, she says a lot in her introduction to answer this question, which is great for us. She wanted to show the truth about Iran and the Iranian people, so there was a lot of backlash in the media at the time about Iran. But she also says she doesn't want those who have suffered as a part of all the things that she depicts to be forgotten. So that's really important as well. Also, I mean, we know it's a kind of autobiography, so what motivated the author? You could say she just wanted to tell the story about her life. That's also a motivation. Sorry. I've clearly my copy and paste skills have not worked here. So the setting of the text, well, it runs from pretty much 1979 to 2000, but also we need to think about the setting in terms of the place, and we know it's set in Iran and Europe as well. So it spans across a really large amount of time and also a large amount of the world, and that's significant when you think about audience as well, because a lot of different people can relate to different parts of the text. Sorry about that, guys. So 2000, when the text was written, it was first published in 2000. Now, it was first published in sections in 2000, and what was happening then? Well, view of Iran was very negative. The Islamic Revolution and things like that meant that media coverage of Iran was very negative. And then what's interesting is that it was first published as a full text in 2007, which is post 9/11, and I'm not sure whether Satrapi has said that that's deliberate or not, but once again, perception of Iran and Islam in general was very negative post 9/11. So perhaps that's why it was released as a full graphic novel during that time. Intended audience. We've got a Western audience. Obviously, it's a text in translation. So it was first published in French, and so that was the first intended audience. And that's because we know from the motivation that Satrapi wanted to help dispel any myths about Iran. So we know that that is the intended audience for that. But it then after being banned for a period of time, it was then released in Iran. So that's another intended audience. And that's significant because it could show people who feel the same as Satrapi. It could be of benefit to them. But also it shines a light on a lot of things that people might not want the light shone on. And that's why it was banned. So that's interesting as well. Marjane's friends and family. The fact that Marjane is a young girl and it tracks her, and we see all her different arguments almost and her different stances in society, that shows us that this media portrayal that perhaps Satrapi was suggesting she wants to dispel is a myth, because we know that Satrapi doesn't agree with all the things that are imposed upon her, and the same with her family. So it gives us a more personal view of Iranian people that counteracts the image that was being portrayed in the media. The torture scenes are very shocking to a Western audience particularly, but also I think her experience in Europe, as a Western reader myself, I found that quite shocking, and interesting that she portrayed her suffering in Europe as well as Iran. So perhaps that goes to show us that perhaps things aren't great in Iran, but they can be not great all around the world, which isn't a very optimistic view, but there we go. Let me just erase this. I do apologise about that, guys. So in The God of Small Things, SL, feel free to just skip forward this part. So, what motivated Roy to write this text? Well, she wanted to shine a light on the barbaric treatment of the untouchables, and we know this because not only has she spoken quite openly about it, but she has she donated all the earnings of her when the novel was first published in Kerala, in the Keralan language, to a society that goes about fighting for justice for untouchable people. So we know that she really felt passionately about that. And also we see a lot of links to feminism and the mistreatment of women in society. So we also get the impression that, and Roy herself was a strong feminist, we get the impression that this was another motivation for writing this novel. So the setting of the text, well, as we know, there's lots of settings for this text, but the main plot takes part in 1969, where there were still really strong like caste systems in place. Kerala, actually, interestingly, has always been one of the most progressive parts of India. I mean, I've been there myself, and it's very beautiful as well. So it was a really good place to set the novel in terms of the beautiful visual setting and the imagery that Roy writes about. But it was very progressive in terms of there's lots of different religions. Even when I visited a few years ago, you could see churches, you could see mosques, things like that. So very progressive, but it still had India's strict caste system. And I think that makes the setting really interesting because in some ways it's very progressive, and we see there's mentions of Christians and things like that in the novel. And perhaps that is used to emphasise how backward this caste system is. The fact that we've got a multitude of people speaking a multitude of language, worshipping a multitude of religions, and yet still we treat people in this way. So perhaps that's it, but maybe I'm just being uber English teacher about it. And it was written in 1997, so things weren't as bad as in 1969, during 1967. But the love laws still existed, weirdly. I mean, that's quite shocking, considering I was 10 years old at the time, so it's very recent, and to think that that system still exists is a bit surreal. But yeah, so that goes to show why Roy did want to write this novel, though, the fact that they still existed. And the intended audience, well, there's a few. It was written in English. It's not a piece of work in translation. So Roy is obviously an Indian speaker, a native Indian speaker, but yeah, she wrote it in English, which is almost unbelievable when you see how beautiful the language is. But I suppose goes to show that the intended audience was an English audience or a Western audience. But you've also got the Indian audience because it was then translated, and they would have very different reactions to this text. Also feminist audience, the treatment of the women in the novel is not great. So you also have the feminist audience who would be reading this. And the reactions to certain parts. So the love laws, I mean, as a Western reader, I found that particularly shocking. And Roy, I think, knows that, the fact that she capitalises the two words, the love laws, and also they are an oxymoron when you put them together. I mean, love is supposed to be about freedom and passion, and laws, they just don't go together. The brutality that we see, particularly to Velusta in the novel, is very shocking. I think the description of it is so detailed that I think any audience would find it shocking. But particularly the fact that it's police doing it makes it more shocking in a liberal Western society, because the police are supposed to be there to protect you, and that's not shown in this novel. The fact that it's a childhood narrative voice, I think again would make it quite shocking and highlight the innocence of the fact that these children are growing up in a society where there's strict laws. I know we spoke about this in our HR lesson yesterday. I mean, children are born with a blank slate, and then they learn to be moral and ethically good, and we are navigating these characters through that part of their life, but they're growing up in a very strict society that some would argue isn't ethical or moral. And so that makes us feel on the side of the author, in the sense that this isn't a right way to be, if that makes sense. And we are exposed to a variety of characters from different ages, different parts of the caste system, different genders. So again, I think that helps us to see how this affects everyone in India. So that is context, guys. All of that you can include in your paper too, to show your understanding of context. Don't just keep repeating the same point about Orwell wanted to write this as a warning, and things like that. Really try to show your extensive knowledge of context. Okay, tip 2 for criteria A is using noun phrases. Now, I know we did a bit of this in our lesson about introductions, but we want to try and give as much detail wherever possible. So we include as many nouns as we possibly can. We should see this as like a scientific essay. We want to give the facts. So I've got an example sentence here. Margie tried to navigate herself through an oppressive society. That's not enough. We can add loads to this. So we could say Margie, as a young girl, one in the buildings, Roman Persepolis, tried to navigate herself through an oppressive society during Okay, so that's just a basic example of how you should be trying to add as many factual details as possible using that noun phrasing to show your understanding. Okay, really try and be as specific as possible. Give dates, give chapters, give specifics, give ages of characters, give parts of the novel, things like that. Just try and be as specific as possible. To highlight that a bit better, I've got an example paragraph here. Now, I've chosen a paragraph that isn't on any text that you've studied. So the two texts, this is actually just one mini chunky referring to the reader. You might have read it as you're all literature students. I'm sure you are doing a lot of reading. But we haven't studied this, so I'm not going to read it out for you, But if you pause the video, you can have a read. And I am telling you, you won't be able to tell me what that novel is about from this paragraph. It's very basic in terms of the details. You don't know who the people are, you don't know what is going on, and it doesn't really explain it very well. The analysis is good, and the structure is good, and things like that, and the links to the question. So all the other criteria is very good, but in terms of the details, not great. So here is that paragraph again, and what we've done is we've added extra details using that noun phrasing in red. So that weren't in this first one, we've added extra details in red. And if you were to read this paragraph now, you would know what the reader is about, or at least who the characters are, and a rough idea about setting and things like that. So that's just a visual representation of how important this noun phrasing is. Someone who is marking your essay should be able to tell what is going on, what the novel's about, and things like that, just from your details that you give. Okay, and the third tip for criteria A is using evidence to show your knowledge. Now, we know this is important, we know this is a big deal, but we also know it's a big task. You should be filling out those big documents that I gave you on all the themes in all 3 of the novels. So please just be adding to those gradually. The more quotes that you can remember for that exam, make them small, make them memorable, but the more quotes you can remember, the better. So you need to give specific quotes, and also contextualizing your evidence. This is a really good way to show your knowledge. You are not going to be able to remember massive chunks of quotes. That's unmanageable for you guys. So you need to be able to contextualize your evidence so that you can show to the examiner, I know these 2 words from a quote, but I can also tell you what is going on at that time, etc. So an example here is if you put something like, in Persepolis, lots of poor kids die when they go to war. That is not an effective piece of evidence. There's just not enough detail there. So, So if you have something like, in the key, lower class young boys are shown going to war and are then depicted in a panel having exploded on the minefields with their keys around their necks. You have explained what is going on. I like to call it who, what, where, when. So this is the where in the key, who, lower class young boys, what, shown going to war, and I suppose when is also in the key. And then you've got your quote as well. So that's how you contextualize a quote and use a quote to show your knowledge. So what does this look like altogether? Well, one of our students from last year got full marks in criteria A. So we're going to have a look at just one of her big chunkies and see where she can where she shows the 3 tips that I've just gone through. So she used the 2 texts, Persepolis and God of Small Things. So both novels craft characters whose behaviours lie beyond the social norms to portray human suffering as an element in their novels. That's the big chunky. If you want to see more about how to craft those, you can see the criteria D video. So in Persepolis, Satrapi utilizes the notion of grief and suffering as a result of violence and warfare to create an authentic yet poignant Bildungsroman. So even in our mini chunky for Persepolis, we've got technical words that show our understanding, like Bildungsroman. So that's really important. A Bildungsroman often concerns the author's journey through life and coming of age, and for 10-year-old Margie, grief first greeted her after her beloved uncle Anoush is executed by the Islamic regime. So if we just take that one sentence, the student says what a Bildungsroman is, showing your knowledge there of the text type. That's also really important. And in your document that I gave you about key themes and ideas for the part 3 text, there is a section there on format of the text and form. So remember to read up on that. We then have 10-year-old Margie. So remember what I said about using noun phrases, giving extra details. That's really showing a good knowledge there. Grief first greeted her after her beloved uncle Anoush, we've got another name there, is executed by the Islamic regime. Been really specific with the type of regime. So we've used a lot of noun phrasing, doing that to show our knowledge. I'm going to have to rub all of this out every time we move the page. Sorry, guys. So, as a young intellectual girl, Margie often seeks comfort in her friend God, whose presence frequently soothes and calms Margie, as well as aids her in navigating her through the complex political system that she lived under. Really great knowledge being shown here. So as a young intellectual girl, Margie, so we discussed in yesterday's lesson about that subordinate clause to start a sentence in order to add extra information. So that, along with noun phrases, is a really good technique in adding our extra information. Her friend God, so we've got another character being introduced specifically, and we've got knowledge of the effect that God has on her. Complex political system that she lived under. Really specific, doesn't just say society, the society that she lived in, it is specific about that society. Yet after Margie's uncle Anoush gets executed by the state, Margie's attitude towards God shifted as she yelled, "Shut up, you, get out of my life." Perfect example of that tip 3 that I went through about contextualizing your quotes. So we've given detail about who, what, when, where, and we've embedded that quote. So if we hadn't read Persepolis, we would know exactly what that quote is referring to. Then we have some analysis here. I won't go into that. You'll have to see video for criteria C for more information on that. Uncle Anoush previously spoke out against the regime and had to escape to Russia. Again, really specific details from the text. Has only just returned to Iran to be welcomed and loved. Struggling to read some of this. Immediately by his niece Margie. Even little things there. We've got niece. Just adding all those nouns that you can just to really show your knowledge is important. Who took great interest in his stories of martyrdom. Thus, the presence of Uncle Anoush, a martyr who lived outside of the norms, that's a really good link to the question, but again, we'll explore more of that in the Criteria B video, is essential for Satrapi to evoke a sense of suffering that she enjoyed when he was executed, and create the notion of her grief and suffering was essential to her coming of age. So we've seen really good knowledge being shown there. We're starting to see how this achieved a 5 for criteria A. So if we move on to the mini chunky about God of small things for this big chunky, SL, I know you haven't studied this, but for me this is a particularly impressive mini chunky in terms of showing knowledge of the text. So keep watching, even though you might not understand everything, just see how it shows that knowledge, how it demonstrates that knowledge. So we start off with the mini topic sentence. Similarly, in the God of Small Things for Luther, and again, I love these embedded clauses as a way to add more detail. So for Luther, comma, a character that suffered the greatest losses in the novel, just adding that embedded clause enables you to show more detail about a character, a thing, or person, etc. As an untouchable, again we've got that subordinate clause and followed by another embedded, the lowest caste rank in the Indian society. So I'm just going to label these just so you can remember. Subordinate clause and embedded. Really great. A way to show extra information. We're just trying to include as many as possible of these things. I'm not even sure whether they were on the screen, sorry. Velutha is considered to be rather privileged. Again, we're just backing up our points with little quotes from the text. Because of his association with the Eat family, being really specific, don't just say the family. His crafts and skill were noticed by Mamachi at a young age. Massive details shown in the text. And was educated and given a job at the Eat family, something unheard of for an untouchable. So we've got details from the text here, followed by contextual knowledge. So covering all parts of criteria A. His identity since then was considered to be inappropriate for the cultural norms, as untouchables were not to be seen associated with people of a higher class rank. We've got more contextual knowledge there shown. So Velutha's identity as an anomaly to the society back then is further exemplified when he was discovered to be having an affair with Amu. Again, another embedded clause to add detail about that character. A woman of a higher class rank and Mamachi's daughter. The affair, again, lovely embedded clause, considered to be blasphemous to the Eat family, eventually resulted in Velutha being wrongfully accused of raping Amu and kidnapping Rahul and Esther. As a result, Velutha was brutally tortured and killed in chapter 18, really specific knowledge, and the history house, beaten to a pulp. His body was repeatedly abused by the touchable policeman through dictions such as smashed, splintered, pulped. So again, we've got our contextualizing of quotes that this student has remembered. Notice here, it's very easy to memorize these kind of words. And all the student had to do was memorize those single words, because the rest you can contextualize in your own words. Okay, so please don't be overwhelmed by the thought of having to memorize quotes. There's really significant ones to remember. That's why I gave you that document to start filling in, because if you can just remember individual words, that's fine. Contextualizing the quote counts as showing your knowledge. Okay, so last little bit now. I won't go into the analysis part shown here. We will get back to the knowledge. Velutha, as a result, is dehumanized and beaten and crushed like an insect. Again, an easy simile to remember, and one that you could probably use in a lot of essays, and it's contextualized. So thus, Velutha is crafted by Roy to embody the suffering caused due to not conforming to norms. So that was just one big chunky in this whole essay, but I thought it was really good at showing why this student got full marks in criteria A. So just remember the top tips, guys. Number 1, show knowledge of the context at all points possible. Number 2, use noun phrasing and sentence structure like subordinate clauses and embedded clauses to add as much factual detail as you possibly can. And number 3, give quotes and contextualize them with specific details from the text. Okay, I hope you found this helpful. Bye.